and welcome to the National Press Foundation webinar here in beautiful downtown Washington, D.C. I'm Linda Topping-Streitfeld, the Director of Programs for NPF. For those who don't know us, the National Press Foundation is a nonprofit whose mission is to improve the work of journalists in the U.S. and around the world, especially on complex topics like the one we're going to tackle today, that expensive, sprawling bit of legislation commonly known as the Farm Bill. On June 21st, the Senate passed the Agriculture Reform, Food and Jobs Act of 2012. The House version is slated to come up in committee on July 11th. The overarching reason to even have a farm bill, of course, is to protect the nation's food supply. It's in the national interest to make sure that despite flooding or drought or tornadoes, U.S. farmers don't go out of business. In modern history, though, the Farm Bill is much broader than a simple safety net. It deals with energy, conservation, research, and a slew of other policies. The cost is nearly $100 billion a year, and a huge chunk of that pays for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, also known as SNAP. So we have lots to talk about, and I hope you'll have lots of questions today. Just type them into the chat panel, which you should see on the right side of your screen, and then click send. We'll get to as many as we have time for. And by tomorrow, we expect to have a recorded version of this webinar on our website. So if you need to review or you want to share it with a friend, you'll find it at www.nationalpress.org. So let's get started. We're very happy to have with us today Loren Duggan. He's the leader of the Bloomberg government's Congress and Budget Analyst team. And Loren will introduce our other guests. Loren?
All right. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's discussion about the Farm Bill, which is a once every 5-year chance for Congress to revisit agricultural policy and set it over the course of the following 5 years. The Farm Bill is primarily about farm subsidies, at least in a lot of people's minds, but it really touches a lot of areas beyond that. Conservation, trade, nutrition programs, you name it, it's in here. And there are a lot of groups around Washington, D.C. who are weighing in, and by extension, groups around the country. I'm happy to be joined today by two Farm Bill veterans. They've seen a couple of bills come and go and are heavily invested in this year's bill as well. I'm joined by Dale Moore, who's the Deputy Executive Director of Public Policy for the American Farm Bureau Federation, and Scott Faber, the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. They both have some presentations, and we'll go through those and then take some questions. Thank you so much. Dale.
Thank you, Loren. I'm going to jump to the part of who does the Farm Bill benefit. Loren touched on it a bit. But basically the Farm Bill is a set of authorizations for virtually every program that USDA has in its portfolio. We obviously have the farm programs. They run the farmers, ranchers, crop producers, etc., the crop insurance programs, conservation, forestry, the nutrition program, which is roughly, 72% of USDA's current budget outlays. It covers the SNAP program, formerly known as food stamps, WIC, school lunch, senior feeding programs, etc. But it also houses rural development. The rural development missionary at USDA can literally build a town from the ground up. Water, sewer, telecommunications, schools, churches, you name it. They can fund it or they can lend for their the construction. It also is home to the legacy that Abraham Lincoln gave to the country, which is the land-grant university system, research, extension, education, which has done a tremendous amount to build agriculture in this country and make us the premier, ag-producing country in the world. And also food safety and animal health. Those are all issues that are critically important, to ag producers. If you go to the next slide, the general background of agriculture, 97% of all the farms in the U.S. are family-owned. They come in all sizes, very large farms to very small farms. In addition, they cover all types of crops. As a general farm organization, Farm Bureau represents virtually every commodity, every type of production system, organic, natural, conventional, biotech, you name it. We've got producers in those areas. Farming is a capital-intensive business. It's something that every farmer needs to know what the farm program or other aspects of farm policy is going to be, so that when he or she sits down with their bankers, they can make sure that those bankers are convinced that what's on the spreadsheet is going to work for them. When we jump to the next Farm Bill, or excuse me, the next slide, the Farm Bill parameters, again, Loren touched on this, typically they are reauthorized every 5 years. The idea behind this is that we can tailor a Farm Bill to fit whatever is going on under the current extension. The situation, the current Farm Bill expires September 30th of this year. Now, there's some exceptions to when exactly certain provisions cease to function, but fundamentally that is the drop dead date. And it basically leaves us that are hoping for a Farm Bill this year with 3 options. We get the new Farm Bill that the Senate's already passed on their floor, the House is going to be working on hopefully in the next week or two, or we can revert to permanent law. Permanent law would take us back to New Deal era policies where the government set quotas on how much a farmer could produce, would set prices that we as consumers would all pay for, and run a very tightly controlled, mandatorily run type of program. The farm program is under attack from a certain standpoint. I use the word attack deliberately because there's kind of 2 fronts. One is the policy battles that we're constantly fighting, and that's not just whether with folks that don't like farm programs and want to get rid of them. That's within the ag family as well. You know, one commodity group likes a certain approach, other commodities like a different approach. General farm organizations like us have to try and find that balance in the middle or off to the side, depending on how they're put together. The other thing is that the agricultural economy over the last decade, really, but certainly the last few years, while the rest of the U.S. economy has been taking a beating, the agricultural economy has having some of the best years that we've had in like forever. Which is why when the Senate Ag Committee and the House Ag Committee last fall started down this road of putting a farm bill together, they proposed saving roughly $23 billion out of the farm program, with $15 billion of that, the lion's share of the savings, coming out of the farm programs themselves. The subsidy programs that cover the so-called program commodities: corn, cotton, wheat, rice, feed grains, pulses, lentils, oilseeds, soybean, etc. The House is poised to mark up their farm bill. Actually, we're going to mark it up the week right before July 4 break. Now it looks like it will start the week after July 4 break, which still gives some hope that we will get a farm bill done. But it is really running out of time in terms of how much time there is to do legislation on the House floor and bring the House and Senate together to reconcile the bills. If we go to the next slide, we look at the changes that the Senate put in their farm bill. And I think, again, just looking at it from kind of an ecumenical standpoint, it eliminates the direct payments, something that had both a lot of political fire coming after it, but also was based very much on a historical payment base. Regardless of what a farmer was doing, whether or not he or she was actually planting the crop for which they were receiving the payment, and something that I'm sure Scott has some thoughts on that he would like to share. But it also gets rid of the acre program and the SURE program. Again, different types of programs that were aimed at providing some level of economic assistance, subsidy, if you will, and replaces that with some new programs, new approaches to programs. The ARC program, which covers virtually all of the commodities except for cotton. Cotton has their stacked income protection program, shorthand stacks. And the new, I guess, player in this group is the supplemental coverage option, the SCO part of the process, which technically, like stacks, is more of a crop insurance type product than it is an income transfer or income subsidy type of program. The other big change, in fact, I would say probably a bigger change than even these programs, is the fact that the Senate bill moves to actual production history. Farmers, payments, whether it's under the ARC program or marketing loan gains, et cetera, those are going to be tied to what they are actually producing, not tied to some historical number that is no longer current with where marketing conditions are. The other thing that we are very pleased with in the Senate package from our perspective is we think they went to great lengths to ensure that we don't have a farm program that encourages farmers to go farm the program, but rather focus on what the market is telling them. The dairy program, I would say some like it, some don't like it, but it's probably the most fundamental change in dairy policy in probably 2-3 decades. And it too is moving to an insurance-like approach based on kind of the relative difference, if you will, between feed costs and where milk prices are. And milk prices in this country can be all over the map, depending on what region you're in. If you're in a dairy deficit region or a production region, whether you're producing for, fluid milk, getting into the cheese markets, all of that kind of stuff. Some of the areas that we are not quite as excited about, there's been a lot of expansion in the means testing side of the program, and I'll be candid, Farm Bureau just flat opposes means testing in these farm programs. But the Senate, in a very bipartisan fashion, voted to expand some of both the payment limits for certain aspects of farm programs, as well as the adjusted gross income limit, which limits participation for farmers that have an adjusted gross income above $750,000, not only in the direct farm programs, but thanks to some, also now applies to crop insurance, at least on the premium side of the equation. We anticipate the House is going to take a different approach, and maybe not so much a different approach, but a more expansive approach in terms of how various options for various program commodities to take advantage of. We haven't seen that language yet, but we are anticipating some differences there. Now, if we go to the next slide, we also touched a little bit on conservation. I think the conservation programs didn't so much change in terms of the scope of what they cover, as Chairwoman Stabenow and Mr. Roberts and the committee worked to consolidate 30 plus programs down to 23
to 13.
23 to 13. Thank you, Scott. So we got 13 programs now, and also kind of streamlining the application process, so I don't have to go from program to program to program to figure out which works best for my operation, but again, bringing in that matrix kind of approach that we can make this work a little better, I think, for the producers. I mentioned the voluntary working lands programs. It also dropped the ceiling a bit on the Conservation Reserve Program. That's where some of the savings, in fact, most of the savings out of conservation come from reducing the land retirement side of conservation programs. And it tightened up some of the conservation compliance. Conservation compliance first came in to a linkage, if you will, with farm programs, where farmers, in order to receive farm program benefits, had to meet certain basic conservation requirements. That's now expanded back, or I guess re-expanded, back to cover crop insurance, which you will note will make Scott smile and nod his head. Not something we're particularly happy with, but again, we got a bipartisan farm bill out of the Senate. It's moving forward, and we're tickled with that. Nutrition reforms on the Senate package aimed at waste, fraud, and abuse. This is roughly $4 billion of the savings. Some of the eligibility criteria are being tightened up, but again, when you're looking at 72% of USDA's budget, $4 billion of savings over a 10-year period is a relatively small cut in that area. We expect that the House is going to have a much tougher fight because their proposed cuts relative to nutrition are much more substantive in their size. I just kind of, with the last slide, wrap up real quick on my part. We again expect the House Ag Committee is going to mark up the week of July 11. I believe that's a Wednesday, actually. The House Ag Appropriations Bill's on hold, which kind of plays into this a little bit because we had anticipated seeing a little bit of a preview show, if you will, of what some of the amendments might be going into House Ag. But the bottom line is we've got a lot of work to do. Floor time on the House and Senate is a precious commodity, and so we're just hoping and praying that all our careful strategies can be supplemented by a lot of divine intervention to get this farm bill wrapped up in a hurry. With that, Loren, I'll turn it over to you, and you can.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Dale. I see we have a couple of questions coming in, and I think we'll get to those right after Scott has a chance to go through some of his slides, but keep sending them in if you have them.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm Scott Faber. I'm the Vice President for Government Affairs for the Environmental Working Group. And I'll provide a quick overview. I'll try not to duplicate the good job that Dale has done describing the bill. As Dale said, the Farm Bill is not really a farm bill. Most of the funding in the Farm Bill goes for anti-hunger programs. About 80% of the funding in the Farm Bill is for anti-hunger programs. The bill primarily helps the farmers of a handful of commodities. Because of how our subsidy programs are structured, many of those payments flow to the largest producers. The largest 10% of farmers collect about 3/4 of all farm spending. So they are, in general, the payments tend to favor the largest, most successful producers. There's been a big increase in the last 3 farm bills in conservation spending. So much so that the Farm Bill is now the primary way that we reward private land stewardship in the United States. I mentioned the hunger programs, and the Farm Bill also, increasingly, especially the new bill that's come out of the Senate, will be doing more and more to promote healthy diets. Some of the big philosophical debates, if we can go to the next slide, in this Farm Bill are whether to use our subsidy programs to cover the sort of frequent, idiosyncratic, shallow losses that every business, including most farm businesses, face from year to year, or whether to have our farm subsidies should really be designed to help cover the deeper losses that might occur because of weather that affects many farmers, or significant changes in the marketplace that affect many farmers. Here, EWG and Farm Bureau are, in some respects, philosophically aligned in thinking that that the focus of our farm safety net ought to be on those deep losses that are the result of weather or market failure, and that we should be asking farmers to use more of their own resources to cover the annual ups and downs of agriculture. The second sort of philosophical debate in this Farm Bill is whether our safety net should be tied to revenue, as we began to see in the last Farm Bill, or whether it should be tied to farm revenue, yield times price, or whether it should simply be tied to price, as historically Farm Bills have. And a third philosophical debate in this Farm Bill is whether to expand crop insurance and whether to place limits on what has become now the primary means by which we support the income of farmers. Crop insurance, the cost of crop insurance has increased dramatically in recent years, from about $2 billion a year about a decade ago to now $9 billion a year. Unlike traditional subsidies, what are called direct payments, countercyclical payments, crop insurance premium subsidies are not limited. There's no limit on who can receive those subsidies. There's no means test. There's also no limit on how much an individual farmer can receive. So as a result of that, just last year, 26 policyholders each collected more than $1 million, and more than 10,000 policyholders each collected more than $100,000. And that's significantly higher than the limits that are now in place and have been in place on subsidies like direct payments, countercyclical payments. There's also very little transparency. While we know who receives direct payments, we know who receives conservation payments, we know who receives disaster payments, we don't know who receives crop insurance premium subsidies. So while they cost more than $7 billion a year on average, and certainly many members of Congress, staff, advocates before the House and Senate Ag Committees receive crop insurance subsidies, our policymakers don't know who they are. And so I think you'll see a debate about that in the House. And unlike traditional subsidies, until the Senate acted last month, the crop insurance recipients aren't required to meet basic environmental protection. They aren't required to take steps to protect wetlands and reduce runoff from their fields. And so some of those issues we think will be part of the House debate and ultimately the next debate. Let's just go to the next slide. Next slide really shows the cumulative cost of subsidies over the last 15 years. It'll surprise many of you to learn that we've now spent, just between 1995 and 2010, almost $250 billion in a variety of different kinds of subsidies to farmers. And as the red parts of these bars show, more and more of the cost of our safety net is coming in the form of crop insurance premium subsidies. Let's go to the next slide. This chart shows that in a little bit more detail. That shows you the increase in crop insurance premium subsidies from 2001 to 2011, and then what CBO expects those premium subsidies to cost over the next decade. again, most of those subsidies are provided to share the cost of insurance with farmers. On average, we pay 62% of the cost of the premium that a farmer will pay is to obtain various kinds of crop insurance. The balance is actually subsidies to insurance companies. So of the $90 billion we're slated to spend over the next decade, about $13 billion of that will be provided to crop insurance companies to deliver these policies to farmers, what's called here on this chart, the A&O subsidy. And the next chart just for further helps tell the story of how important crop insurance subsidy, premium subsidies become to farmers. For all of the commodities you see here, with the exception of rice, crop insurance premium subsidies have become more valuable to subsidized farmers than direct payments. And it helps provide some context to the decision to end direct payments and to reinvest much of those savings into both a revenue guarantee program and expanded crop insurance and the crop insurance title of the Farm Bill. And just go to the next slide. And for those of you who want to dig a little bit deeper, I think we're gonna click on this link for you. Did we successfully click on the link for our viewers?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, we did. All right. Hopefully that'll pop up. Okay, you need to, well, it's going to be harder than it looks like. You need to click no there, and then it'll take you to our farm subsidy database. For those of you who want to dig a little deeper, you can go in and look at our farm subsidy database. Some of the interesting things, I mentioned that there were 26 recipients who each collected more than $1 million. Some of the other interesting things about crop insurance is that we see the same sorts of concentration that we see with traditional subsidies. So for example, while the largest 20% of crop insurance premium subsidy recipients collect on average about $55,000, the bottom 80% of recipients collect about $5,000 a year. So that gives you some sense of, and I think that makes sense for any of you who buy car insurance or homeowners insurance. The more valuable the crop, the larger the policy. So naturally, the premium will be higher, and since the government is paying on average 62% of that premium, the cost of the government will be higher. Why don't we go to the next slide? One of the reasons that groups like the Environmental Working Group care about crop insurance is that crop insurance subsidies in many cases make it possible and even attractive for farmers to plant or to attempt to plant in places where they wouldn't otherwise. In other words, it makes it attractive to plant in places where farmers wouldn't if they were simply responding to market forces. There's a great quote, you see it on your screen here, from a farmer in Minnesota who, in a recent story by Ron Nixon in the New York Times, when you can remove nearly all the risk involved and guarantee yourself a profit, it's not a bad business decision. And I can farm on low quality land that I know is not going to produce and still turn a profit. And so as a result of, we'll go to the next slide, as a result of this combination of insurance subsidies and very high prices for commodities, we're seeing significant changes in the landscape. If we want to go to the next slide, please. And these next two maps help capture just how much, just in the last few years, how much conversion of grasslands and wetlands. If we can show the next map as well, the one that shows acres of grassland, shows just how much farmland or how much grassland and wetland is being converted in order to produce row crops. That means that many of these lands are lands that are buffering our streams. They're providing habitat for various kinds of wildlife, but now they're being put under the plow as a result, again, of both this combination of unlimited insurance subsidies and very high crop prices. The next slide shows that as a result of these extreme pressures on the land, a long and very successful history of avoiding wetland loss, which has been primarily driven by the adoption of conservation compliance, as Dale mentioned, and great stewardship by farmers. A lot of that progress is now in jeopardy. We went from a time in our history when we were losing hundreds of thousands of acres of wetlands every year to now a period recently where we were seeing a small surplus in the creation of wetlands. We're beginning to erode a lot of the gains that we've made in recent decades. So I'll wrap up by talking a little bit about what's in the Senate bill and then what we expect to see in the House bill, and then we'll turn it over to your question. Next slide, please. As Dale said, the Senate bill ends direct payments, which were provided regardless of need, because they were tied to your production history, and eliminated the traditional countercyclical payments that were tied to a statutorily set price for that would guarantee a certain price for these covered commodities, subsidized commodities, and replaces that with a new shallow loss revenue guarantee program that for these eligible commodities will guarantee up to 89% of the 5-year average revenue of a farm operation. It's a very generous revenue guarantee. The Senate bill also expands crop insurance, as we heard, and in order to help finance these generous new entitlements, the Senate has cut conservation programs by more than $6 billion. These programs that reward farmers who take steps to protect wetlands and grasslands, or take steps to improve water quality or air quality, or provide habitat for wildlife, took a disproportionately large cut in the Senate bill. As Dale mentioned, the bill also cuts nutrition funding. There's a bit of good news. The Senate bill also provided some significant new investments to promote healthier diets, especially by linking consumers with local farmers and providing incentives for food stamp recipients to purchase more fruits and vegetables. Going to the next slide, the Senate bill also reduces insurance premiums for the largest farms by introducing means testing. Senators Durbin and Coburn successfully offered an amendment that would reduce by 15% subsidies for the largest and most successful farms, crop insurance subsidies for the largest and most successful farms. Senator Chambliss also successfully championed an amendment that would require that farmers who receive these crop insurance subsidies have to take steps, have to adopt basic protections for the environment. Unfortunately, the Senate bill did not, and the Senate did not provide an opportunity to debate a couple of other critical reforms. One is to begin to cap crop insurance subsidies. Senator Shaheen and Senator Toomey were prepared to offer an amendment to limit those subsidies to $40,000 per recipient. They weren't given the opportunity to offer that amendment. Senators Begich and McCain sought to offer an amendment to allow USDA to disclose the names of crop insurance subsidy recipients. That was also not part of the agreement that ultimately determined whether you got to offer an amendment. And lastly, Senator Gillibrand's amendment to reduce subsidies to crop insurance companies was defeated. If we go to the next slide, again, many of you are probably surprised to learn that each year we provide about $1.3 billion, not to farmers, but to crop insurance companies and agents to sell policies to those farmers. As this chart shows, many of these companies are now owned by parent companies or holding companies that are based outside the United States in insurance tax havens like Bermuda and Switzerland. So I expect that as we move to the House, we might see more debate over those issues. So maybe I'll just wrap up by talking a bit about the House bill.
Sure.
As we heard, the House bill will, unfortunately, propose to make much deeper cuts to feeding assistance programs and nutrition programs. Unfortunately, we'll propose to make even deeper cuts to conservation programs. I think we all expect that the House bill will include a safety net that is tied to price and not tied to revenue, as the Senate bill is. I think none of us expect the underlying bill to include many reforms, means testing, payment limits, transparency, or restoring this requirement of basic environmental protections. I think there'll also be less support in the House bill, unfortunately, for efforts to promote connections between local farmers and consumers and to promote healthier diets. And as Dale said, the key issue really is the deadline, that Congress needs to act to renew the Farm Bill by September 30th, or we revert back to 1949 farm law. A short-term extension is not a very attractive alternative for farmers or their lenders. These are very complicated programs, and so if we fail to pass a bill, a new farm bill, I think the most likely scenario is that we'll see a one-year extension and relitigate many of these issues in the fall and in the spring. Why don't I stop there and turn it back to you?
Sounds good. One of the questions I have about the Farm Bill is, in both the House and the Senate, you have to get to a majority, 218 in the House, probably 60 in the Senate to get something through. And when you look at the votes, they don't always fall along party lines. Sometimes they're more regional lines or distinctions being drawn. And I wonder if you could touch on how you get to a majority on this bill, if you can.
Well, typically getting to a majority in a farm bill, particularly in an odd-numbered year, is not that big of a challenge, Loren. One of the things that, though sometimes vexes the political process, is that farm bills are not bright red R or bright blue D kinds of debates. They tend to be discussions of the differences between commodities, among regions of the country, among the different interests on how we approach it, how much control big farmers, small farmers, organic versus biotech, wheat versus corn versus cotton versus, the specialty crops that aren't covered by some of the programs. And so what it tends to be is a bipartisan approach from the political party affiliation, but, fairly historically, grounded types of coalitions of, the southern crop producers working together, the dairy industry working together, livestock producers, western land producers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, on down the line. That's where the politics comes from. And in the Senate in particular, virtually every senator has some interest, however big or small, on an ag bill. In the House, the calculus becomes a little different because you've got so many districts for whom agriculture is basically the grocery store. That's right. Probably as close as most folks will get to agriculture. That's where the nutrition side of the discussion comes in, and that's why on the House side, with the deeper cuts that are proposed on nutrition, can pose a challenge in getting to that 218 votes that you mentioned. That's pretty much where that falls down.
Do you have any?
I'll just say that the only thing that's really different about this farm bill that we wouldn't see in a normal cycle is you have this extraordinary deficit pressure, $1.3 trillion deficit, which sort of is a backdrop and is forcing members on both sides of the aisle, but especially on the Republican side of the aisle, to look harder at how we find savings in this farm bill. And then you also have this sort of odd dynamic where many of the new members of the House Agriculture Committee, many of the new members of the Republican caucus are members who came here because of their affiliation with the Tea Party. The notion of having the government set prices for commodities, intervene in the dairy market, intervene in the sugar market, provide $1 million in premium subsidy to very successful businesses. Those are all notions that are sort of counterintuitive for many members of the Republican caucus and some members of the Democratic caucus. So that's further complicating the normal horse trading that goes on to get to 218.
We'll go to one of the questions that's been sent in. Natalie from Minnesota has asked, how will the Farm Bill help the dairy farms? I guess that's an example of one of the many types of crops.
Colin Peterson, who is the ranking Democrat on the House Ag Committee, has brought to the table something that I cannot remember the last time that dairy regions all over the country actually agreed on a single policy. And I know some have some concerns about how, again, it's an insurance type of product, and like any insurance, you buy the insurance, whether you get something out of it each year is a matter of what happens, whether it's revenue-based, yield-based. The dairy folks have given up their milk income loss program and other dairy supports and trading that for an insurance type product. It's called margin insurance, and basically what they're insuring is that risk that they have to carry in terms of their feed costs versus what they're getting for their commodity. There's also some supply management issues that are tied to that, at least in the Senate package. But I would say for the dairy farmers, particularly for the Minnesota dairy farmers, the fact that Mr. Peterson wrote it, I got to believe that the majority, that if there's one place where it's going to work pretty well, it's going to be in Minnesota.
Do you have anything to add on that
I
one?
think it's a good summary.
And in general, what do you see as the crops that are winning in this bill or losing in this bill? Is that maybe the wrong way to look at it?
Well, it's certainly that's some of the fighting that's going on amongst, fighting may be too strong a word, but certainly the wrestling that's going on amongst the various commodity groups is who wins and who loses. I think I was smiling. One of the ironies of this move that we've seen toward crop insurance, that for decades, literally going back to the early to mid-'80s, farmers kept getting told, you guys, you need to manage your risks. You need to take advantage of the crop insurance that's out there and make that work for you. That should be the way that you protect against your risk. And over those same period of time, crop insurance has gradually improved. There are some commodities for which it works better than others. There are some, particularly in the specialty crop areas, some commodities that need better coverage. And what we've seen, particularly since 2000, when we saw this growth starting in the revenue type policies as opposed to a yield loss policy, is that kind of emerging, if you will, between the income support in Title I of the Farm Bill, the so-called farm program subsidies, with the crop insurance type of model. And with that coming out of the mix, now farmers, they've got risks to manage. They can buy their crop insurance. They take that approach, and when they lay it out, we've got kind of a new approach to farm programs. We're getting away from ad hoc disaster assistance. We've got more certainty in the budgeting process. So, kind of a progress, albeit one that gets looked at through a different lens than 10 years ago when this would have seemed pretty radical.
There's certainly a lot of caterwauling coming from some southern farmers, because especially peanut and rice farmers, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the fact that they are getting an unfair deal from this farm bill. I think it more reflects that they've gotten an extraordinarily generous deal in past farm bills. We actually posted some analysis a few weeks back that shows on a per acre basis, rice, cotton, peanut farmers were earning on average about $50 an acre in subsidies, primarily as a result of the direct payments program, while their brothers and sisters growing corn, beans, and wheat were getting in the neighborhood of $20 to $30 per acre in subsidy. And so when you sort of strictly look at how well do folks fare on a per acre basis, there's been a long period where southern farmers have received more government support than farmers elsewhere in the country. Certainly there is not a great deal in this bill for livestock producers. So while there's a program to help dairy farmers manage their risk issues, and there's more generous subsidies for the producers of commodities like corn, beans, wheat, etc. There's not much in this bill for livestock. In fact, many of the conservation programs that livestock farmers use, especially the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, take a hit in this bill. And lastly, there's not much in this bill for very small farmers, and in fact you could argue this bill goes in the wrong direction for many small farmers, because it does nothing to deal with much of the concentration of payments that creates an unlevel playing field. As I mentioned before, while the largest recipients of crop insurance are in some cases getting $1 million, or on average the top 20% is getting $50,000 in premium subsidy, the bottom 80% of premium subsidy recipients are getting about $5,000 a year. So there's been really no steps taken, very few steps taken in this bill to address the unlevel playing field. One winner, I think, are organic farmers. There's some additional resources for them. There's also an amendment offered on the floor of the Senate that would ensure that organic farmers are treated fairly by USDA when they seek crop insurance. So I think I think that's always the case, but that there are winners and losers. But I think if you look at the whole panoply of agriculture, there are a few big winners and a few small winners, but mostly losers.
I would say the biggest winner, though, in a farm bill, just to put the agricultural point on it, are America's consumers, who enjoy the safest, most affordable supply of food. Scott's looking at me funny, but this is the stump speech. We enjoy one of the least costly supplies of food in this country, and it's one of the reasons that we're careful to point out when you are looking at agricultural production the way we look at it, which is we need everybody involved. Small farmers, large farmers, all different kinds of production, because there are a number of people who have the wherewithal to decide what exactly they want to spend their food dollar on. There are a number of people, great number of people, as we've seen in the current economic situation, for whom having enough dollars to feed their family is the most critical decision they make. So ensuring that there's ample supplies of food, that it's safe and that it's wholesome. We need every farmer out there producing what they can and delivering it to whatever means and marketing approach they prefer.
Well, and this is really the heart of what I think should be the real debate over this farm bill is and there's two issues, I think. One is, I think everyone agrees, with probably a few exceptions, that we ought to be helping farmers obtain the right level of risk protection, that we ought to be sharing the cost of insurance. The key question is, are we paying more than we need to solve the problem that we set out to solve 12 years ago when we increased premium subsidies and we increased subsidies to insurance companies? So, and to put a finer point on it, do we need to continue to provide 62% as taxpayers of the premiums that farmers buy to purchase crop insurance? Is that more than we need to pay to ensure that farmers have risk protection? Could we provide less subsidy, especially for the larger producers, and still have them in the pool and buying insurance and making sure they have adequate coverage? I think if you asked ag economists, whether it's Carl Zuloff or Bruce Babcock or sort of the other deans of agriculture, I think they would all agree that we've solved the problem we set out to solve. We now have more than 1 million policyholders, more than 260 million acres of land subject to a policy, and that we no longer have to provide as much subsidy to solve the problem that we set out to solve, which was incomplete insurance, if you will. The other part of the question is how important are these subsidies ultimately to the price of food at retail? And I think if you went and looked at the analysis that was just done of the Senate bill that looked at different scenarios, at the end of the day, because these subsidies primarily flow to corn, soybeans, wheat, and that those commodities are not a major cost of the production of making food, that the price at retail changes very little depending on which way you go with subsidies, whether you use a price-based approach or revenue-based approach, whether you have payment limits or don't have payment limits. At the end of the day, the price that consumers pay at the grocery store isn't really impacted very much by the choices that the Congress will make in Title I or Title 11, the commodity or crop insurance titles of the Farm Bill. And so I would argue just the opposite, that this Farm Bill has really failed consumers, because when consumers were asked what they thought the #1 priority of this Farm Bill ought to be, they overwhelmingly said doing more to help promote healthier diets, doing more to help make it easy for me to make a healthy choice. And we invested more money, about $700 million in new money to help promote healthier diets, but nothing on the scale that we provide to help share the cost of risk protection with farmers. And so I think in that sense, it was the Senate bill, although it certainly did better thanks to the leadership of Senator Stabenow, better than past farm bills. It really was a missed opportunity to attack what is, I think everyone recognizes is a huge economic and social problem, which is our rising levels of obesity and the fact that most Americans aren't covering half their plates with fruits and vegetables.
I think that shows how there's a different perspective on the bill and people come at it from different sides. One crop-related question before we move on. Someone asked, is there any help for farmers who grow vegetable produce crops? I think you heard about corn and wheat,
yeah.
But...
I would say, yeah, one of the things that is remarkable about to us is we had proposed this in a way, at least sort of reaching into that area. Typically, fruits and vegetables are not covered under Title I. And this farm bill is not really that much different, but this new supplemental coverage option approach that's in the crop insurance title, and kind of by extension, I guess we call that, a farmer-based, risk management tool. If you can buy a crop insurance policy on a particular commodity, revenue or yield, you can buy the supplemental coverage option insurance to go along with that. And we think that that is a great step forward in terms of, we think, helping encourage specialty crop producers to look at this as a risk management tool, providing that opportunity. But we also think that it might encourage looking into some of the crops that aren't covered. Recently one of our young farmer and ranchers was in town with Chairwoman Stabenow's invitation to talk about what he had experienced with his cherry crop and his plum crop, orchard crops that he really can't cover that well with crop insurance. He is going to have about 10% of his harvest this year. That's devastating no matter how you cover it. And crop insurance is going to cover a very minor part of that simply because products were not available in that regard.
Okay. And I think what many people don't know is that while the corn, bean, wheat, cotton, and rice guys continue to be the primary beneficiaries of crop insurance subsidies, some of the biggest beneficiaries are producers of fruits and vegetables, especially tomatoes, potatoes, some, in the case of tomatoes, high-value crops that are grown in multiple counties in different parts of Florida or California. So when you go back to our and look at our database, you'll be surprised to see that many of the biggest recipients, many of the policyholders who collected more than $1 million are farmers who are growing fruits and vegetables.
Yeah, I would correct just a little bit. They haven't collected $1 million. They have paid their what?
Let's just say they did not pay more than $1 million to obtain insurance because the government paid it for them.
Yeah.
It sounds like a gift by any reasonable definition. But I think the other, and of course there are other, thanks to Senator Stabenow's leadership, there are other provisions in the bill that help address fruit and vegetable growers' needs, and especially research.
Critical.
I think that where we would probably differ is on the level of subsidy for this new supplemental coverage option. And so, which could at least cost at least $3 billion over the next 10 years, and $3 billion a year over the next, $3 billion over the next 10 years, but could ultimately cost much more than that as more farmers elect to take advantage of it. And I think the real question, it goes back to the fundamental question, is should we be paying, in this case, 70% of the premiums that farmers have to pay to obtain this higher level of coverage? How much of that should farmers pay? And I think those are the questions that hopefully the House will really debate. We didn't have that debate in the Senate. It sounds like a sort of an inside game, but ultimately, to me, that's really the real question. It's not whether we should be helping farmers obtain crop insurance. It's how much do we have to pay? And if we're not spending as much to help farmers obtain crop insurance, what other investments could we be making that would be helping other farmers, consumers, the environment, the hungry? You know, that's the sort of the debate that we really ought to be having at this point.
Do you think that supplemental crop insurance survives in that final deal?
I think it's
yes.
I think it's gaining more and more attention from members who are worried about the potential cost of a new insurance, a new subsidized insurance tool. I think it'll probably be included in some form, but I wonder whether the subsidies will be quite as generous as the Senate imagines.
Well, this farm bill, as much as anything, and you mentioned it, is being driven by the budget.
Right.
So exactly where that premium assistance may fall down in terms of supplemental coverage option, or the other types of insurance programs will get sorted out. But the fact is, it's insurance and it's moving producers in a direction that we think is really helpful to all of us in terms of managing risk.
One of the earlier questions we had is on the research title of the bill, which I don't think either of you touched on yet, but what are your thoughts on the research provisions in there and whether these scientific outcomes are needed for the gains in other parts of the bill to be achieved?
Well, the research title of the bill, and a lot of that's discretionary spending, so that's not only authorized in the Farm Bill, but subject to the annual appropriations process. There are a couple of things that the Senate did that we think are helpful. Number one, there's the creation of this authority to create a foundation. And it's like any of these processes, if the foundation it gets up and running, how does that affect the appropriations process? You know, do the appropriators, you know, in order to meet their targets, simply offset what the foundation is raising? I think we look at, you know, the National Institutes of Health and the foundation that they have, how the private sector and their contributions to the process has helped spur along research so that the government is not carrying quite so much of that effort. I think it applies pretty much across the board in agricultural production. You know, the type of production research that's going on today, particularly in the field like of biotechnology, and frankly even in kind of the organic side, is being conducted kind of outside the department, but there are still those gaps, whether it's basic research that provides the tools that, you know, the methods types of research can bring, you know, to application in a farm or a field or livestock operation or a forest or you name it. Those are areas that we continue, you know, that public type of research that benefits everybody. It's also why we think that it's not just about the research, it's the education and the extension that goes along with that. One of the beauties of the model of the way U.S. agriculture grew in this country over the last 200 or 150 some years since USDA was created was we not only did the research and we not only got the smart folks figuring out how to make things work better, but we also have a system for making sure that that farmer that lives down that last dirt road, by himself, and he gets the same access to that information. That's part of what comes out of this as well. So it's not just the research itself, but getting it delivered to the countryside.
Yeah, and there again, I think we agree that it's important. It's just, to me, it's a missed opportunity that if we'd been able to provide more mandatory funding, and one of the unique things about the Farm Bill is there are programs that are subject to appropriations, and there are things that are not subject to appropriations where Congress will decide we will spend X over the next 5 years. This was a missed opportunity to, as Dale said, do more to help all farmers. These research programs really do help all farmers, and it's a shame that we couldn't find more resources to really meet some of the research needs.
And what do you think about the Foundation for Food and Ag Research? The same questioner asks, a public-private nonprofit. Do you think that will help increase investments, or is it something that will be offset by reduction?
I think it will increase investments. I think that what it will set in motion, we've seen a little bit of this, and I think it's still sort of waiting for folks to really see that Congress means it. The earmark process, for example, that has gone away, and a lot more of a competitive grant or competitive focus on those types of programs. And that's what the private foundations, at least the ones I'm aware of that do research, focus on that competitive type research. And some will argue, well, that's not fair because the smart folks that know how to write the research proposals get in and get their stuff. It's like, just getting grants from foundations for anything else. But the approach to it means that there will be another source of investment, if you will, in research and agriculture. I think the appropriators, as long as they have to deal with budgets, there is a chance that there could be some offset. But I think, like anything, appropriators have to do that every year. And if a foundation gets up and running and the investment dollars come in, the foundation will also have a set of parameters as to how it does its grant, and it may focus on areas, again, that either it wants to be exclusive on, or that it kind of are outside the lanes that the public sector research is focused on. I tend to get accused of being an optimist quite often in this town. I think it is nothing but a benefit for agricultural research as a whole.
Okay, great. Another question came in about the conservation changes that are in the bill, and somebody asked what the impact of cutting 7 million acres of conservation land would be on water and wildlife. I don't know if you have thoughts on that?
Well, I'm sure Scott and I have a unique set of thoughts on this particular point. Having spent 8 years of my life working at USDA, and particularly when the desire because of expansion in bioenergy and corn as a feedstock and ethanol raised this question, shouldn't we take land out of CRP, Conservation Reserve Program? In analyzing those acres, that 7 million number, it actually could be a little higher, I think, but you've got a number of acres that initially went into CRP when, the environmental benefit yardstick, if you will, was much closer to the ground. Basically, did it have a soil erosion index? Yes, okay, you qualify for CRP. Over time, particularly the distance between the 85 Farm Bill to the 90 Farm Bill, the 90 Farm Bill to 95, those criteria for getting in CRP have gradually ratcheted up. And I think everyone agrees that you need to keep the environmentally sensitive lands in some type of permanent cover, basically wildlife habitat, grasslands, trees, all the different ways that it's approached. But there are probably 7 to 10 million acres in the CRP that could be productive lands that would be subject to a conservation compliance plan if they wanted to come out of the program, be farmed. That would also, I think, bring some productivity back, but in a conservation resource management sort of way.
Well, and here, I think we just disagree that certainly there are some lands that are in CRP that shouldn't be, but there are lots of lands that should be enrolled into CRP that aren't. And using an updated yardstick, as you put it, and and cutting the program so dramatically. And to provide some context, we've now gone from 39 million acre program to 32 million acre. Now we'll go to a 25 million acre program. When you look at that over time, we're seeing the loss of obviously 14 million acres of grassland that's providing, that's helping keep our water clean, that's reducing the cost of treating our drinking water, and that's providing habitat for lots of wildlife, especially in many cases endangered species, and ultimately reducing some of the regulatory conflicts that farm groups profess to be so concerned about. Yeah, I think the even bigger picture here is this is just the wrong time to back off on our commitment to conservation. There is extraordinary pressure being placed on the land. There are changes to the landscape that we haven't seen the likes of since the 1970s, where farmers, because of the combination of very high prices and the unlimited nature of our subsidies, farmers are plowing up lands that they never would have touched even 5 years ago. And that combination of kind of putting the foot on the pedal in terms of plowing up land, production agriculture, and taking our foot off the brake by cutting CRP and other conservation programs, it's going to create significant new water quality challenges. It's going to create new endangered species conflict. It's going to compound our air quality challenges in places like California. And it's going to create more regulatory conflict at a time when farm groups are trying to avoid regulatory conflict. So I really wonder why the Farm Bureau and the crop groups aren't fighting harder to protect what are voluntary programs where farmers are lined up around the block, especially for programs like EQIP to enroll. Why aren't farm organizations standing up and saying, you know what, this is the last place we should be cutting given all of the pressure that's being placed on the land? Why aren't we looking harder at cutting subsidies for the extraordinarily successful businesses that are reporting record income and sparing these programs that help all farmers and that give farmers what groups like Farm Bureau say they have been asking for, voluntary incentive-based stewardship?
Well, I think we'll have to leave that debate to go on. We only have about a minute left here. I guess my last question for both of you, as quickly as you can, do you think this gets done this year, or is this an issue for the next Congress?
It's going to be a heavy lift. There's not a whole lot of time left on the House or Senate floors, at least before adjournment. There's a lot of talk about, well, we can do this in lame duck. And frankly, I think the lame duck is oversubscribed already by about 2.5 years worth of floor time. So there is an opportunity to get this done. It's going to take a hard-nosed, dedicated approach to get it across the finish line. But I would say yes, but the chances right now are about in that 15% range.
I think in order for the president to sign a farm bill this year, there's no way to pass a farm bill that has deeper cuts to conservation and nutrition than the Senate bill, and that ultimately would pass the Senate. So for this bill to clear the floor of the House and ultimately be accepted by the Senate, there has to be more reform in these commodity programs in order to satisfy the right flank of the Republican caucus. And there will be debates over cutting SNAP, but deeper cuts to SNAP are a dead letter in the Senate. Deeper cuts to conservation are a dead letter in the Senate. So to pass a bill that I think the president will sign, we're going to need more leadership on Title I and Title 11. Look harder at how do we continue to have a safety net that helps farmers when they need help, but that doesn't provide them more subsidy than they really need to obtain a generous safety net.
Well, thank you both very much for joining us today, Dale Moore and Scott Faber, and I'm Loren Duggan, and thank you so much to the National Press Foundation and our viewers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This is great.
It's fun.
I've got some answers for you on that.
Keep going. Keep going. I guess
I thought they were rhetorical questions.
So, you guys did a great job.
Papers we can.
We still have all